Britain is the most powerful country in the world. The year is, of course, 1800, and a young dominant general called Napoleon is turning heads in Europe, as he's slowly turning the continent into a battlefield so that he can set up his rule as a tyrannical dictator. With each genius stroke he plays on the battlefield, he humiliates great ancient dynasties as he pulverizes battle-hardened nations with ease. Britain's dominance as an empire is being encroached, and they feel the squeeze of Napoleon's vice-like grip. But now it is time for Britain to fight back. The plucky Brit will not take this lying down. Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm of course the Knight of History, and this is part number 4 of the French Revolution story. In this episode we are going to discuss the fact that Britain, once a land of revolutionaries, actually fought back against the French Revolution. We're also going to discuss another individual that I'm a massive fan of, Admiral Horatio Nelson. And of course we're going to discuss his brilliance as a naval commander. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Now, let's get into this. Even though we have already talked about Napoleon and his fantastic rise to power, to understand Britain's response in whole and all the battles, etc. I promise we're going to talk about the battles and everything about Horatio Nelson, but first we need to understand the politics behind this move. Right at the beginning of the French Revolution is where our story starts. As it began, many Britons saw the French Revolution as positive. They celebrated France's attempt to move away from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy, and from feudalism to individual liberty, just like Britain had done in the Glorious Revolution. One member of the political party, the Whigs, Charles James Fox, wrote how much the greatest event is it that happened in the world, and how much the best. He was a big fan of the revolution, of course, but as the revolution became more radical, opinion changed throughout England and Britain as people became increasingly polarized. In 1790, another Whig member called Edmund Burke wrote reflections on the revolution in France. Here he claimed that the revolution was too violent and too destructive to be successful. He predicted that the revolution would lead to more bloodshed and military rule, both of which came true. Burke's book actually provoked a response from England's best-known radical writer, a person called Thomas Paine. He was the working-class son of a rope maker. Paine helped to actually start the American Revolution with his book, Common Sense. In 1791, Paine actually wrote a book celebrating the French Revolution entitled The Rights of Man. Here Paine criticized the monarchy, the aristocrats, and organized religion, calling for radical political reform throughout Britain as well. A year later, the feminist Mary Wollstonecraft wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women, proposing equal education rights for women, an idea at this point in time which was far ahead of the ideals. Now, what am I actually getting at here? Am I just rambling on? No. The fact is that England and Britain was a land of revolutionaries, and it was liberal and welcomed all manners of ideas and ideals. However, following the hostilities and with France's declaration of war on Britain in 1793, these ideas quickly lost popularity. British radicals were accused of being dangerous Jacobins and often were attacked openly in the streets. Britain's Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger actually passed laws preventing radical ideas happening and breaking out. Radical activities were repressed. In 1794, Pitt even suspended the Habeas Corpus Act so that any suspected radical could be imprisoned without a trial. In 1795, the Seditions Meeting Act made it illegal to hold a meeting of more than 50 people without a license. Then there is the whole mess of the British control of Ireland. In 1791, a group of Irishmen inspired by both the American and French revolutions formed the United Irishmen. They hoped that they would liberate Ireland from British rule with the help of French troops. In 1796, a French invasion fleet with 15,000 soldiers actually set sail for Ireland, but they were unable to land on the coast due to the bad weather. Tired of waiting for French help, the United Irishmen actually staged a simultaneous uprising across the entire Irish nation in May 1798. It was led by a Dublin lawyer called Wolfe Tone. Now, these uprisings were brutal in nature. The British army was actually called in to put them down, killing 10,000 suspected rebels. Tone was captured and sentenced to death. Whilst he was waiting for his execution in jail, Tone actually committed suicide by slitting his own throat with a razor blade, not giving the British people the right to kill him. This whole bloody mess was actually feared by the British because now they were worried that Ireland could be used as a backdoor to Britain, by France, of course. To gain more control over the country, the Parliament actually passed the Act of Union in 1800. From January 1801, Ireland became of a new country called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. But the Irish story isn't actually over here. It doesn't finish here, and we will cover the Irish situation in the future. Now that the English were worried about revolution coming to their shores, anytime they got to beat up the French, they took it. So, during the campaign in Egypt in 1799, Napoleon took his fleet from Toulon to Alexandria in Egypt, stopping in Malta to conquer it just because. But the whole voyage, Napoleon was worried about one thing in particular: the British Navy and their commander, Admiral Horatio Nelson. So Napoleon and his navy hurried along as quickly as they could to Alexandria. As soon as Nelson actually heard about the French fleet going through the Mediterranean, he set out in hot pursuit. Although he didn't manage to catch them in the Mediterranean, he did catch them where the French thought that they were in a defensible position, anchored just off of the Bay of Alexandria. When Nelson arrived, he attacked immediately, and he attacked hard. After 3 hours of a naval battle, having destroyed the French flagship, the Orient, the French fleet was defeated. The English were victorious in the Battle of the Nile, setting up the Royal Navy in a dominant position for the up-and-coming Napoleonic Wars, especially because it left the French troops completely stranded in Egypt. Now, in 1803, when Napoleon was still just the first Chancellor of France, not made himself the emperor yet, he resumed France's plan to actually invade Britain. He assembled the army of Britain on the French coast with a massive 165,000 men and 2,500 landing craft, and they began to run drills practicing their invasion in the northern parts of France. On the English coast in Kent, people could see the French invasion force gathering with their telescopes, sending the British people into fits of terror. Napoleon knew that in order to invade Britain, he would first have to gain control of the British Channel. But he also knew that in order to do that, he would need to defeat the British Royal Navy, the strongest naval power that the world had ever seen. They had continued to grow in size and strength and expertise since the 18th century, overcoming scurvy with lemon juice and making their ships out of copper-plated hulls, giving them greater speed and endurance at sea. The British Navy were a real force to be reckoned with, and Napoleon knew that he could not risk his 1,065,000 men drowning at sea. So he called off the attack and focused his troops. Now, by the time that Napoleon had actually made himself emperor, putting the crown of the French on his own head in 1805, and starting to dominate European politics, the British got nervous. So what they did is they sent their very best, Horatio Nelson, to attack the joint forces of the French and Spanish navies off of the coast of southern Spain. The battle-hardened and famously fearless leader Nelson, who had by this time already lost an eye at the Battle of Calvi in Corsica in 1793, and he had also lost an arm in 1797 at the Battle of Santa Cruz de Tenerife against Spain. By the way, Nelson 100% deserves a video of his own in the future. So what Britain did is they sent their very best, Admiral Nelson, during the War of the Third Coalition. That's the third time that the combined forces tried to gang up and beat down Napoleon. On the 21st of October 1805, Nelson engaged in a combined effort with French and Spanish ships off of the Cape of Trafalgar. Normally during naval battles, the two sides would line up in one line and fire upon each other, just because it's actually easier to signal to each other to see what is going on. But just as Napoleon was a military genius leader on land, Nelson was a military genius leader on sea, and he sent his ships in two parallel lines towards their enemy. This genius stroke worked for Nelson because the French and Spanish fleets were devastated, losing 22 ships and sustaining 5,781 casualties, whilst the British, on the other hand, did not lose a single ship, but they did actually lose 1,666 individuals. Nelson found victory against the combined forces of the Spanish and French, proving his brilliance and Britain's domination at sea. However, one of the 1,666 casualties was actually the man himself, Horatio Nelson. He was on his flagship giving orders when a French musketeer sniper found himself just 15 meters away from Nelson. In this cacophony of noise, a musket ball zoomed through the air and struck him in the shoulder. The ball entered his left shoulder, passing through a lung, then his spine at the 6th and 7th vertebrae, and lodged itself just 5 centimeters below his right shoulder blade in the muscle of his back. He collapsed to the floor and turned to his servant, Hardy, and said, "Hardy, I do believe they've done it at last. My backbone is shot through." Two sailors picked Nelson up and carried him down below, but as they were carrying him, he stopped them to continue to give commands, telling his ships to advance. Placed in the care of the ship's surgeon, he knew that his time was up, and Nelson was comforted by Hardy, his servant and best friend. Just before Nelson passed away, news actually came down that the combined forces had surrendered and Nelson's fleet was victorious. On receiving the news, King George III is alleged to have said with tears in his eyes, "We have lost more than we have gained." Now, even though the great naval leader had been killed, the British were in fact victorious. But the whole time that these coalitions were happening, and the whole time Britain and the rest of Europe were teaming up against France, they ridiculed Napoleon himself, calling him short, a myth that persists even today. He was actually 168 centimeters tall, normal height for his day. Amongst other things, cartoons and satire were used to ridicule the man. But it did not get him down, and he still continued to dominate much of Europe for now. Because next time we are going to discuss the end of the French domination with the downfall of Napoleon. I really hope that you enjoyed that. I really hope that you actually learned something as well. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. The more you know.